One of the strangest shipwrecks in history occurred in New Zealand in 1902. The Ventnor, a steamer built in 1901, sank with a cargo of 5,347 tonnes of coal, bales of flax, tow and fungus, and 499 corpses. The Cheong Shing Tong was a charitable association of Chinese working in New Zealand, many as miners. These men paid into a fund to enable them to be buried in their homeland, should they die while on foreign soil. If they returned to China alive, their contribution allowed them to avoid a fee for embarking in their fatherland. As a fee was also collected from relatives of the dead in China, only those who had family to request their return were exhumed. Mr. Mi Chang, accompanied by an inspector, a clerk, a tinsmith, and a couple of other men, travelled for a year across New Zealand, overseeing the exhumation of bodies from about 40 cemeteries in Auckland, Palmerston, Wellington, Greymouth, Otago, Christchurch, and other areas. A similar repatriation of deceased Chinese had occurred in 1883, when 230 bodies were returned home. In the end, 499 coffins were prepared for transport in 1902. Newspapers of the day were intrigued by this process, and it was reported widely in New Zealand and Australia. When the body was disinterred, it was treated as wet or dry. A wet body was one which still had some flesh remaining. These bodies were carefully washed, dried, and wrapped in a linen with a label bearing the deceased's name. The tinsmith was on hand to make zinc coffins for these bodies on site. The newly made coffins were immersed in water as a test to ensure that they were airtight. Then the bodies were placed in their coffins and immediately soldered shut. A small screw was placed in the top of each zinc coffin as a safety valve, should a body emit enough gas to cause the coffin to fail under pressure. These zinc coffins were then in turn placed inside a wooden coffin, constructed of 1.5 inch thick kauri timber, and labelled with the name of the occupant. A dry body was one which had already decomposed down to bones. The bones were meticulously retrieved, washed and dried, labelled and wrapped in a cloth bundle, then placed in a wooden coffin. It was noted that some bodies had become skeletonized within 2 or 3 years, whereas others were buried in conditions which preserved them. One body unearthed from Southland, after 19 years in the grave, was found to be in an excellent state of preservation, resembling a mummy. The coffins were stored and then moved to Wellington, in readiness for being placed aboard ship. The old coffins were returned to the earth and the graves refilled. Copious amounts of disinfectant were used during the process. The Ventnor was loaded in October 1902. The coal was intended for the British Navy stationed at Hong Kong. Also on board the Ventnor were 10 dead servants, who, considering the cargo, ironically, were very much alive. These passengers were actually Chinese sailors, whose contracts had finished while they were on ships in New Zealand waters. Their employers were obligated to return them to Hong Kong, but they were termed dead servants rather than passengers. The coffins were stowed in specially fitted compartments, with 4 coffins of men who were important during life given their own compartments each. One of these men was Choi So Hoi, known as Charles So Hoi, a wealthy Dunedin merchant and community leader who had founded the Cheong Shing Tong and arranged the 1883 shipment of cadavers. So Hoi had been born in Panyu in the 1830s and had gone to California as a gold miner, then to Australia as a merchant, before finally settling in New Zealand in 1869. He became a New Zealand citizen in 1873, and in addition to his import business, invested in gold dredging and mining. On the 22nd of July, 1901, as he was leaving to go to his office for the day, he turned at the gate to wave farewell to his wife, suffered a stroke and died. The news of his death was reported in newspapers across Australia and New Zealand. The Ventnor set to sea on the 25th of October 1902 under the command of Captain Ferry. Early on the morning of the 26th of October, about 1:30 a.m, the ship struck rocks south of Cape Egmont. Immediately the hold began to take on water. The ship's engines were reversed and she was put on half speed. The pumps worked through the night to empty the tanks, and although the lifeboats were made ready, it was not considered that the ship was in immediate danger. The pumps worked throughout Sunday, although by the evening the inrush of water was beginning to defeat them. By Monday morning the Ventnor had made 60 or 70 miles, with the intention of reaching Auckland, although the ship was sitting lower in the water than normal by 5 feet. By Tuesday morning at 6 a.m, the water was over the forepeak of the ship. At this point the captain altered course to land, but the ship, which was steering well the day before, was now proving to be unmanageable. After a conference, it was decided to stay on the ship and keep going to reach landfall. At 12 o'clock the lifeboats were provisioned, and by 2 p.m, when land was finally sighted, the decks were awash as they were now flush with the sea level. The engine stopped 10 miles off Hokianga Heads, but it was decided to remain on the vessel until daylight on the following day. However, by 9 p.m, the main deck was under water, and at 9:30 p.m, the boats were launched. Soon after, the side lights went out, and the Ventnor began to sink, bow first, in water over 300 feet deep. The captain gave the order, "Shove off, boys." In the confusion, it was unclear what happened next. The captain may have fallen overboard and been rescued, or he might have made it without incident onto one of the boats. It was thought, with the Ventnor sinking quickly, that this one of the 4 lifeboats was caught in the undertow and pulled down with the ship. A French sailor and 2 Chinese escaped from the boat before it met its fate. 2 of the boats made it to shore, despite having to battle through breakers to cross a sandbar. The 3rd ship, with 10 people aboard, was rescued by the tugboat the Energy. The 4th boat and some wreckage washed up 40 miles north of Hokianga 2 weeks later. 13 people were unaccounted for, including the captain, following the sinking. When news of the sinking became known, some superstitious minds dwelt on the old wisdom that a corpse on board a ship was bad luck. An old sea captain who had sailed the China coasts was asked for his opinion and said it was bosh. He had himself transported many bodies from one area of China to another. While there was some wariness from the crew in handling the coffins, he said a little extra pay overcame their fears swiftly. Yet while deep-sea sailors were reluctant to handle the coffins of the Chinese, they absolutely refused to touch those of a European. A nautical court of inquiry in November heard accounts from the survivors and decided that Captain Ferry was to blame for the wreck, either through negligence or incompetence. Some of the crew had reported that he had been drinking, but the other officers said this was mere rumour. By the end of December, the Cheongshing Tong had hired the Energy in an attempt to locate the wreck and salvage at least the body of Charles So Hoi, whose family had stated that they were prepared to spend thousands of pounds on the effort. For over 3 weeks at the start of 1903, the Ventnor was sought, but in vain. In early February 1903, the first 4 of the coffins washed ashore. Over the years, more of the coffins would be returned by the sea. Local Maori people who discovered the coffins reverently reburied the bodies near their own cemeteries and tended to the graves. In 2007, a Chinese gate was erected and a grove of 22 kauri trees planted on the coast near where many of the coffins washed ashore. A traditional Baiji ceremony held to honour the dead inaugurated the grove. It was not until 2012 that Sonar showed a wreck was located in 480 feet of water off Hokianga Heads, and proven to be the Ventnor when a submersible robot was sent down to investigate it in 2013. A joint New Zealand television production was made in 2014 titled The Lost Voyage of 499, retelling the story and of how people from different sides of the Pacific Ocean were bonded by the wreck of the Ventnor.